Section 20 of A Dozen Ways of Love. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MaryAnn. A Dozen Ways of Love by Lily Dougall. A Freak of Cupid, Chapter 4. When the March morning shone clear and white through the still falling snow, and the Morns began to bustle about their work for the day, the mental atmosphere in the kitchen seemed to have lost something of the excited alarm that had prevailed in the night. Courthope arose. The garments which he had donned in the night with frantic speed clothed but did not adorn him. He knew that he must present a wild appearance, and the domestic clothesline, bound round and round his arms, prevented him from so much as pushing back the locks of hair which straggled upon his brow. He was rendered on the whole helpless, however murderous might be his heart, a tolerable safe companion. He interested himself by considering how Samson-like he could be in breaking the cords, or, even tied, how vigorously he could kick Morin if he were not the girl's prisoner. He reflected with no small admiration upon the quick resource and decision that she had displayed, how, in spite of her almost childlike frankness, she had beguiled him into turning his back to the noose when a supposed necessity pressed her. He meditated for a few minutes upon other girls for whom he had experienced a more or less particular admiration, and it seemed to him that the characters of these damsels became wan and insipid by comparison. He began to have a presentiment that love was now about to strike in earnest upon the harp of his life, but he could not think that the circumstances of this present attraction were propitious. What could he say to this girl, so adorably strong-minded, to convince her of his claim to be again treated as a man and a brother? Letters? He had offered them to her last night, and she had replied that anyone could write letters. Should he show her that he was not penniless? She might tell him in the same tone that it was wealth ill-gotten. It was no doubt her very ignorance of the world that, when suspicion had once occurred, made her reject as unimportant these evidences of his respectability. But he had no power to give her the eyes of experience. These thoughts tormented him as he stood looking out of the window at the ever-increasing volume of the snow. How long would he be detained as a prisoner in this house, and, when the roads were free, how could he find for Madge any absolute proof of his innocence? The track of the midnight thief was lost for ever in the snow. If he had succeeded in escaping as mysteriously as he had come, but here Courthope's mind refused again to enter upon the problem of the fiend-like enemy and the impassable snowfields, which in the hours of darkness he had already given up, perceiving the futility of his speculation until further facts were known. Courthope strolled through the rooms, the doors of which were now open. Morin permitted this scant liberty, chiefly, the prisoner thought, because of a wholesome fear of being kicked. In the library at the back of the drawing-room he found amusement in reading the titles of the books down one long shelf and up another. Every book to which Madge had had access had an interest for him. 3 cases were filled with books of law and history. There was but one from which the books had of late been frequently taken. It was filled with romance and poetry, nothing so late as the middle of the present century, nothing that had not some claim upon educated readers, and yet it was a motley collection. Upon the front rim of the upper shelf, someone, perhaps the dead father in his invalid days, had carved a motto with a knife, the motto that was also that of the British Arms. It might have been done out of mere patriotism. It might have had reference to this legacy of books left to the child maidens, for whom, it seemed, other companionship had not been provided. At length Courthope realized that there was one book which he greatly desired to take from the shelf. The Morn daughter was dusting in the room, and, with some blandishments, he succeeded in persuading her to lay it open upon the table where he could peruse it. To his great amusement he observed that she was very careful not to come within a yard or 2 of him, darting back when he approached, evidently thinking that the opening of the book might be a ruse to attack her by a sudden spring. At first the curious consciousness produced by this damsel's awkward gambols of fear so absorbed him that he could not fix his attention upon the book. Flashes of amusement and of grave annoyance chased themselves through his mind, like sunshine and shadow over mountains on a showery day. He knew not which was the more rational mood. Then, Attempting the book again, and turning each leaf with a good deal of contortion and effort, he became absorbed. It was The Letters of a Portuguese Nun, and in the astonishment of its perusal he forgot the misfortune that had befallen the household, and his own discomfort and ignominy. The Morin girl had left him in the room, shutting the door. An hour had passed. It might have been around 9 of the clock, when Courthope began to be roused from his absorption in the book by a sound in the next room. It was a low uncertain sound, but evidently that of sobbing and tears. He stopped, listened. His heart was wrung with pity. It was not the sharp little Eliz who cried like that. He knew such sobs did not come from the stormy and uncontrolled bosoms of the French servants. He was convinced that it was Madge who was weeping, that she was in the long drawing-room where the portrait of the judge hung near the door. He went nearer the door. His excited desire to offer her some sympathy, to comfort, or if possible to help, became intolerable. So conscious was he of a common interest between them that not for a moment did the sense of prying enter his mind. He heard then a few words whispered as if to the portrait. "Father, oh, Father, we were so happy with him. It is almost the only time that we have been quite happy since you went away." The sense of the broken whispers came tardily to Courthope's understanding through the smothering door. The handle of the door was on a level with the hands that were bound to his sides. He turned himself in order to bring his fingers near it. Before he touched it, he heard Madge's sob and whisper again. "I was so happy, Father. I thought it was such fun he had come. I like gentlemen, and we never see any except the ones that come out of books." To Courthope it suddenly seemed that the whole universe must have been occupied with purpose to bring him here in order to put an end to her gloom and flood her life with sunshine. The universe could not be foiled in its attempt. Young love argues from effect to cause, and so limitless seemed the strength of his sentiment that the simplicity of her mind and the susceptibility of her girlhood were to him like some epic poem which arouses men to passion and strong deeds. Ignominiously bound as he was, his heart lightened. All doubt of his mission to love her and its ultimate success passed from him. He turned the handle and pushed the door half open. The long drawing-room was almost dark. The shutters had not been opened. The furniture remained as it had stood when the brilliant assembly of the previous evening had broken up. The large fireplace was full of ashes. The atmosphere was deadly cold. Courthope stood in the streak of light which entered with him. Upon the floor, crouching, her cheek leaning against the lower part of her father's picture, was Madge King. She was dressed in a blanket coat. Moccasins were upon her feet. A fur cap lay upon the ground beside her. At the instant of his entrance she lifted her bare head, and across the face flushed with tears and prayers there flashed the look of haughty intolerance of his presence. She had thought that he was locked up in one of the kitchens. She told him so, intensely offended that he should see her tears. It was for that reason that she did not rise or come to the light, only commanding and imploring him to be gone. "I am quite helpless, even if I wanted to harm you," he spoke reproachfully, knowing instinctively that if she pitied him she would accept his pity. "You have harmed us enough already," she sighed. "All the rest of our silver, all my dear father's silver is gone. We found that out this morning. For what we had used for the feast had been put in a basket until we could store it away. It is all taken." He was shocked and enraged to hear of this further loss. He did not attempt to reason with her. He had ceased to reason with himself. "You trusted me when you let me in last night," he said. "Don't you think that you would have had some perception of it last night if I had been entirely unworthy? Think what an utter and abominable villain I must be to have accepted your hospitality, to have been so happy with you." So he went on appealing to her heart from the sentiments that arose in his own. Madge listened only for a reasonable period. She rose to her feet. "I must go," she said. He found that she proposed to walk on snowshoes 3 miles to the nearest house, which belonged to a couple of parish priests, where she would be certain of obtaining a messenger to carry the news of this robbery to the telegraph station. She could not be brought even to discuss the advisability of her journey. Mourn could not be sent, for the servants and Eliz would go mad with terror if left alone. To Courthope's imagination her journey seemed to be an abandonment of herself to the utmost danger. If between the two houses she failed to make progress over high drifts and against a heavy gale, what was to hinder her from perishing? Then, too, there was that villain, who had seemed to stalk forth from the isolated house afar into the howling night as easily as the Frankenstein demon, and might even now be skulking near, a dangerous devil, able to run where others must trudge toilsomely. Madge, it seemed, had only come to that room to make her confession and invoke protection at the shrine of the lost father. She was ready to set forth without further delay. She would not, in spite of his most eloquent pleading, set Courthope at liberty to make of him either messenger or companion. "The evidence," she said sadly, "is all against you. I am very sorry." A wilder unrest and vexation at his position returned upon his heart because of the lightening that had come with the impulse of love. That impulse still remained, an undercurrent of calm, a knowledge that his will and the power of the world were at one, such as men only feel when they yield themselves to some sudden conversion. But above this new-found faith, the cross-currents of strife now broke forth again. Thus he raged. "What was the use of my coming here? Why should the fates have sent me here if I cannot go this errand for you, or if I cannot go with you to protect you? If this beast is walking about on snowshoes, how do you know that he will not attack you as soon as you are out of sight of the house?" She seemed to realize that it was strange to be discussing her own safety with her prisoner. Very curious was the conflict in her face, her strong natural companionableness, her suspicion of him, and her sense of the dignity which her situation demanded, contended together. It seemed easier for her to disregard his words than to give all the answers which her varying feelings would prompt. She was tying on a mink cap by winding a woolen scarf around her head. "Miss Madge, Miss King, it is perfectly intolerable. It is intolerable." He stepped nearer as he spoke. A thought came over him that even the conventional title of Miss, which he had given her, was wholly inappropriate in a situation so strong. That he and she, merely as man and woman, as rational beings, were met together in a wilderness where conventions were folly. "I cannot allow you to risk your life in this way." There was a tense emphasis in his words. He felt the natural authority of the protector over the tender thing to be protected, the intimate authority which stress of circumstance may give. She dropped her hands from tying the scarf under her chin, returning for his words a look of mingled curiosity, indecision, and distrust. Quick as she looked upon him, his mind's eye looked upon himself. There he stood in grotesque undress, bound around with cords of an extraordinary disgrace. He blamed himself at the moment for not having had his hair cut more recently, for he knew that it stood in a wild shock above his head, and he felt that it dangled in his eyes. Then a gust of emotion, the momentary desire for laughter or groans of vexation, rose and choked his utterance, and in the minute that he was mute the girl, sitting down upon a low stool, began tightening the strings of her moccasins, which, after the first putting on, had relaxed with the warmth of the feet. Her businesslike preparations for the road maddened him. "Don't you see," he said, "what disgrace you are heaping upon me? What right have you to deny me, a gentleman and your guest, the right to serve and protect you? Consider to what wretchedness you consign me if I am left here. To think of you fighting alone with this dangerous storm, or attacked by blackguards, who we know may not be far away." She said in a quiet, practical, girlish way, "It was I who was responsible for letting you in last night, and then this happened, this most unheard-of thing. We never heard of any but a petty theft ever committed in this whole region before. Now I am bound to keep you here until we can hear where father's silver is." "You don't believe that I have done it. I'm sure you don't." He believed what he said. Why haven't you the courage to act upon your conviction? You will never regret it." "Liz says that she saw you quite distinctly." "Liz is a little fool," were the words that rose within him, but what he said was, "Your sister is excitable and nervous. She saw the thief undoubtedly, and by some miserable freak of fortune he may have resembled me." "Does that seem at all likely?" "Well, then there was no resemblance, and she fancied it." She stood up, looking harassed, but without relenting. "I must go. There is nothing else to be done. Do you think I would stay here when a day might make all the difference in recovering the things which belong to my father? Do you think I am going to lose the things that belong to him just because I am too much of a coward to go out and give the alarm?" She walked away from him resolutely, but the thought of the lost treasures and all the dear memories that in her mind were identified with them seemed to overcome her. She drew her hand hastily across her eyes, and then, to his dismay, the sorrow for her loss emphasized her wavering belief in his guilt. For the first time he realized how strong that sorrow was. Impelled by emotion, she turned again, and came shrinkingly back into his presence. "I have not reproached you," she said, "because I thought it would be mean in case you had not done it. But it seems that you must have done it. Won't you tell me where the other man has taken our things? They cannot be of any value to you compared to their value to us. And, oh, indeed, I would much rather give you as much money as you could possibly make out of them, and more too, if you would only tell me which way this man has gone, and send word to him that he must give them back. I will pledge you my word of honour that—" For the first time he was offended with her. He stepped back with a gesture of pride, which in a moment he saw she had construed into unwillingness to give the booty up. "I could promise to give you the money. I could promise that you should not be tracked and arrested. I have enough in the savings bank of my own that I could get out without our lawyer or mamma knowing it, and you don't know how dear, how very dear, everything that belonged to father is to Liz and me. If you wait here tied until my stepmother comes, she will not give any money to get the things back. She would not care if you kept them, so long as she could punish you." Every word of her gentle pleading made the insult deeper and more gross, and the fact that she was who she was only made the hurt to his pride the sorer. He could not answer. He would not explain. He would let her think what she liked. It is the way of the injured heart. Angry, and confirmed in her suspicion, she too turned proudly away. He saw her, as she crossed the hall, take up a pair of snowshoes that she had left leaning against the wall, and without further farewell to anyone turn toward the front door. He knew then what he must do. Without inward debate, without even weighing what his act's ultimate consequences might be, he followed her. "I will do what you ask. I give you my word of honour, and there is honour, you know, even among thieves, that I will do all in my power to bring back everything that has been stolen. Give me snowshoes. Keep my horse and my watch and my luggage as surety that I mean what I say. I cannot promise that I will get back the silver from the other man, but I will do far more than you can do. I will do more than anyone else could do. If it is within my power, I will bring it back to you." She considered for a little time whether she would trust him or not. It seemed, curiously enough, that from first to last she had never distrusted her first instinct with regard to his character, but her childlike belief that in the unknown world all things were possible allowed her to believe also in his criminality. Now that he had, as she thought, made his confession and promised restitution, it was perhaps the natural product of her conflicting thoughts and feelings that she should trust to his oft-repeated vows, and make the paction with them. She did not consult the Morans. Perhaps she knew that she would only provoke their opposition, or perhaps she knew that they would only be too glad to get rid of the man they feared, caring for nothing but the actual safety of the lives of the household. She brought him his coat and cap, and also a man's moccasins and snowshoes. With a courage that, because somewhat shy and trembling, evoked all the more his admiration, she untied the first knot of his rope, unwound the coil, and then untied the last knot. The process was slow because of the trembling of her fingers, which he felt but could not see. She stood resolute, making him dress for the storm upon the threshold of the door. He did not know how to strap on the snowshoes. She watched his first attempt with great curiosity. Looking up, he was made the more determined to succeed with them by seeing the pain of incredulity returning to her eyes. "How do you expect me to know how to manage things that I have never handled in my life before?" "But if you don't know how to put them on, how can you walk in them?" "I've seen men walk in them, and there are a great many things we can do when something depends upon it." She directed him how to cross and tie the straps. She continued to watch him, increasing anxiety betraying itself in her face. The snow was so light that even the snowshoes sank some 4 or 5 inches. It was just below the porch that he had tied his straps, and when he first moved forward he trod with one shoe on top of the other. He had not expected this. He felt that no further progress was within the bounds of possibility. For some half-minute he stood, his back to the door, his face turned to the illimitable regions of drifts and feathery air, unable to conceive how to go forward, and without a thought of turning back. When his pulses were struggling and tingling with the discomfort of her gaze, he heard the door shut sharply. Perhaps she thought that he was shamming and was determined not to yield again. Perhaps, and this seemed even worse, she had been overcome in the midst of her stern responsibility by the powers of laughter. Perhaps, horrid thought, she had gone for MaryAnn to bid him again throw the noose over his treacherous shoulders. The last thought pricked him into motion. By means of his reason he discovered that if he was to make progress at all the rackets must not overlap one another as he trod. His next effort was naturally to walk with his feet so wide apart that the rackets at their broadest could not interfere. The result was that in a few moments he became like a miniature Colossus of Rhodes, fixed again so that he could not move, his feet upon platforms at either side of a harbour of snow. He heard the door open now again sharply, and he felt certain, yes, certain, that the lasso was on its way through the air. This time he was not going to submit. As men do unthinkingly what they could not do by way of thought, he found himself facing the door, his snowshoes truly inextricably mixed with one another, but still he had turned round. There was no rope, no MaryAnn. Madge was standing alone on the outer step of the porch, her face aflame with indignation. "This is either perfect folly, or you have deceived me," she cried. "I shall learn how to use them in a minute," he said humbly. He was conscious as he spoke that his twisted legs made but an unsteady pedestal, that the least push would have sent him headlong into the drift. "How could you say that you would go?" she asked fiercely. He looked down at his feet as schoolboys do when chidden, but for another reason. The question as to whether or not he could get his snowshoes headed again in the right direction weighed like lead upon his heart. "I thought that I could walk upon these things," he said, and he added, with such determination as honour flying from shame only knows, "and I will walk on them, and do your errand." With that, by carefully untwisting his legs, he faced again in the right direction, but, having lifted his right foot too high in the untwisting position, he found that the slender tail of his snowshoe stuck down in the snow, setting the shoe pointing skyward and his toe, tied by the thongs, held prisoner about a foot above the snow. He tried to kick, but the shoe became more firmly embedded. He lost his balance, and only by a wild fling of his body, in which his arms went into the air, did he regain his upright position. The moment of calm which succeeded produced from him another remark. "It seems to me that you have got me now in closer bonds than before." As he spoke he turned his glance backward and saw that comment of his was needless. The girl had at last yielded to laughter. Worn out, no doubt, by a long-controlled excitement, laughter had now entirely overcome her. Leaning her head on her hand and her shoulders against the pillar of the porch, she was shaking visibly from head to foot, and the effort she made to keep the sound of her amusement within check only seemed to make its hold upon her more absolute. "I don't wonder you laugh," he said, feebly beginning to laugh a little himself. But she did not make the slightest reply. Her face was crimson. The ripples of her laughter went over her form as ripples of wind over a young tree. He was forced to leave her thus. By a miracle of determination, as it seemed, he freed his right shoe and made slow and wary strides forward. He saw that he had exaggerated the width of his snowshoes, but his progress now was still made upon the plan of keeping his feet wide apart, although not too wide for motion. He knew that this was not the right method. He knew that she peered at him between her fingers and was more convulsed with laughter at his every step. He was thankful to think that the falling flakes must soon begin to obscure his figure, and he did not dare to try another plan of walking while she watched, lest she should see him stop again. End of chapter 4. Section 21 of A Dozen Ways of Love. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MaryAnn. A Dozen Ways of Love by Lily Dougall. A Freak of Cupid, Chapter 5. Courthope had struck across the main road at right angles to the Poplar Avenue. The poplars stood slim, upright, more like a stiff and regular formation of feathery seaweed growing out of a frozen ocean than like trees upon a plain. He was nearing a grove of elm and birch which he had not seen the evening before. By the almost hidden rails of the fence there were half-buried shrubs. So dry, so hard, so absolutely without bud or sere leaf was the interlacing outline of the trees and shrubs that they too seemed to be some strange product of this new sort of ocean. They did not remind him of verdant glades. Not that beauty was absent, nor charm, but the scene was strange, very strange. The domain of the laughing princess, on whom he had turned his back, was, in the daylight, more than ever an enchanted land which he could fancy to be unknown in story and until now unexplored by man. Such ideas only came to him by snatches. The rest of him, mind and body, was summed up in the fierce determination to catch the thief and bring back his spoils. Whether by this he would prove himself honest or guilty, he neither knew nor felt that he cared. Gradually, as he thought less about his snowshoes, he found that the wide lateral swing which he had been giving to his leg was unneeded. Strange as it seemed, the large rackets did not interfere when he took an ordinary step. Having made this pleasant discovery, he quickened speed. He did not know whether the girl had stopped laughing and had gone into the house again, but he knew that the falling snow and the branches of the trees must now hinder her from seeing him distinctly. In a moment he was glad of this, for, becoming incautious, he fell. Both arms, put out to save himself, were embedded to the very shoulders straight down in snow that offered no bottom to his touch. When his next impulse was to move knees and feet, he found that the points of his snowshoes were dug deep, and his toes, tied to them, held the soles of his feet in the same position. What cursed temerity had made him confess to a criminal act in order to allow him to come on this fool's errand? Fool, indeed, had he been to suppose that he could walk upon a frozen cloud without falling through. Such were Courthope's reflections. By degrees he got himself up, but only by curling himself round and taking off his snowshoes. By degrees he got the snowshoes put on again, and mounted out of the hole which he had made, with snow adhering to all his garments, and snow melting adown his neck and wrists. He now realized that he had spent nearly half an hour in walking not a quarter of a mile. With this cheerless reflection as a companion he went doggedly on, choosing now the drifted main road for a path. Having left behind him the skeleton form of the trees, he trudged across an open plain, flat almost as the surface of the lake which he had traversed yesterday. Sometimes the fences at the side of the roads were wholly hidden. More often they showed the top of their posts or upper bar. Sometimes he could see cross fences, as if outlining fields, so that he supposed he still walked through lands farmed from the lonely stone house, that he was still upon his lady's domain. He meditated upon her. judging that she was sweet beyond compare, although why he thought so, after her mistrust and derision, was one of those secrets which the dimpled Cupid only could explain. He was forced to acknowledge the fact that thus he did think, because here he was walking, whither he hardly knew, battling with the gale, hustled roughly by its white wings, in danger at every turn of falling off the two small moving rafts of his shoes into a sea in which no man could swim very long. He wondered, should his snowshoes break, if he would be able to flounder to the rim of the fence? How long could he sit there? Certainly it would seem, looking north and south and east and west, that he would need to sit as long as the life in him might endure the frost. At length, a shed or a small barn met his eye. His own approach seemed to have been heard and answered from within. The neigh of a horse greeted him. At first he supposed that some horses belonging to the house were stabled here, and neglected because the roads were impassable. Then he judged that so slight a shed could not be intended for a stable. He answered the animal's cry by seeking the door. Against it the drift was not deep, for, as it opened on the sheltered side, he had only the snowfall to scrape away. The door, which had very recently been freed from its crust of frost, yielded easily. He found a brown shaggy horse tied within, and beside it a sleigh, such as he had frequently seen, a mere platform of wood upon runners. Otherwise the shed was empty. Courthope was quickly struck by the recognition of something which set his memory working. The old buffalo skin on the sleigh was such as was common, but the way it was stretched upon a heap of sacks made him remember the sleigh that he had yesterday passed upon the river, and the keen, sinister face of the driver, which had ill contrasted with his apparent sleep and stupidity. Courthope tossed aside the skin with a jerk. A rum bottle, a small hoard of frozen bread and bacon, a heavy blanket folded beneath, all seemed to prove that the driver had made provision for a longer journey. The horse had no food before it, no blanket was upon its back. Probably its driver had not intended to leave it here so long. Where was the driver? This quickly became in Courthope's mind the all-important question. Why had he been skulking on the most lonely part of the lake? And now, recalling again the man's face, he believed that he had had an evil design. Courthope pursued his way, for, whether the thief had gone farther or remained in its vicinity, it was evidently desirable to have help from the nearest neighbours to seek and capture him. Courthope soon reached what seemed to be a dip or hollow in the plain. In this the wind had been very busy levelling the surface with the higher ground. At first he supposed that, for some reason, the road and fences had come to an abrupt ending. Then he discovered that he merely walked higher above the natural level. The thought came to him that if he should here break his snowshoes, there would not be even the neighbouring fence-top on which to perch and freeze. Suddenly all his attention was concentrated on a dark something, like a bit of cloth fallen in the snow. As he came close and touched the cloth, he found it to be the covering of a basket almost buried. Pushing away the snow-crusted covering and feeling with eager fingers among the icy contents, he quickly knew that this was no other than the stolen silver of which he was in quest. A thrill of gratitude to fortune for so kindly a freak had hardly passed through his mind before his eye sought a depression in the snow just beyond. He saw now that a man was lying there. The head resting upon an arm was but slightly covered with snow. The whole form had sunk by its own heat into a cavity like a grave. Courthope lifted the head. The face was that of the man whom he had seen yesterday upon the river. The arms, when he raised them, fell again to the snow like lead. Yet he perceived that life was not extinct. Even in the frost the odour of rum was to be perceived, and breath, although so feeble as to be unseen, still passed in and out of the tightly drawn nostrils. The touch, that would have been reverent to a corpse, was now rough. He shook the fallen man and shouted. He raised him to a sitting posture, but finding that, standing as he did upon soft snow, to lift him was impossible, he laid him again in the self-made grave. That posture, at least, would be the most conducive to the continued motion of the heart. Standing upon the other side of the body, Courthope's shoe struck upon another hard object, which he found to be a case, stolen locked as it was, which contained, no doubt, the other valuables whose loss Madge had first discovered. The wretch, weighted by a burden in each hand, had apparently missed his way when endeavouring to return to the shed in which he had left his horse, and wandering in circles, perhaps for hours, had evidently succumbed to drink and cold, caught as in a trap by the unusual violence of the storm. There was nothing to be done but to return to the house for Morin's aid, and, lifting the handles of basket and case in either hand, Courthope doubled back upon his own track, thankful that he had already attained to some skill in snowshoeing. As he neared the house his heart beat high at the excitement of seeing Madge's delight. He closely scanned the windows, even the tiny windows in the pointed tin roof, but no eager eyes were on the lookout. Loudly he thumped upon the heavy front door. There was somewhat of a bustle inside at the knock. The snow-bound household collected quickly at the welcome thought of a message from the outside world. When the door was opened, Madge and the Morins were there to behold Courthope carrying the plunder. He perceived at once that his guilt, if not doubted before, was now proved beyond all doubt. There was a distinct measure of reserve in the satisfaction they expressed. Madge especially was very grave, with a strong flavour of moral severity in her words and demeanour. Courthope explained to her that the other man was dying in the snow, that if his life was to be saved no time must be lost. She repeated the story in French to Morin, and thereupon arose high words from the Frenchman. Madge looked doubtfully at Courthope, and then she interpreted. It seemed that the Frenchman's desire was to put him out again and lock up the house, leaving the two accomplices to shift for themselves as best they might. Courthope urged motives of humanity. He described the man and his condition. At length he prevailed. Madge insisted that if Morin did not go she would. In a few moments both she and Morin were preparing to set out. It seemed useless for Courthope to precede them. He went into the dining room, demanding food of Madame Morin. He found that Elize had been carried down and placed in her chair in the midst of domestic activities. As soon as she spied him, being in a nervous, hysterical state, she opened her mouth and shrieked sharply. The shriek at this time had more the tone of a child's anger than of a woman's fear. With a strong sense of humour he sat down at the table, and she, realizing that he was not imminently dangerous, railed upon him. "Viper in the bosom!" said Elize. Courthope, almost famished, ate fast. "Daughter of the horse-leech crying, 'Give!' and sucking blood from the hand it gives," she continued. "Sir Charles Grandison would never have kicked a man when he was down," he said. "He would have tried to do good even to the viper he had nourished." The memory of Sir Charles's well-known method, even with the most villainous, appeared to distract her attention for a moment. "And then they all sent for him and confessed and made amends, just as I have done," Courthope went on. But the fact that a laugh was gleaming in his eyes enraged the little cripple. "How dare you talk to me, sitting there pretending to be a gentleman?" "I would rather be allowed to make a better toilet if my reputation were to rest upon a pretence. I never heard of a gentlemanly villain who went about without collar and cuffs, and had not been allowed access to his hairbrush." "A striped jacket and a shaved head is generally what he goes about in after he's unmasked. If I had been Madge, I would not have let you off." "Come, remember how sorry Elizabeth Bennet was when she found she had given way to prejudice. If I remember right, she lay awake many nights." "Are you adding insult to injury by insinuating that either of us might bestow upon you—" "Oh, certainly not. I merely wish to suggest that a young lady possessing lively talents and remarkably fine eyes might yet make great mistakes in her estimate of the masculine character." The cripple, who perhaps had never before heard her one beautiful feature praised by masculine lips, was obliged to harden herself. "Accomplished wretch!" she cried, in accents worthy of an irate Pamela. "Do you suppose it was the last time I was serving my term in jail that I read our favourite novels?" he asked. By this time Morin had passed out of the door to put on his snowshoes, and Courthope, who had swallowed only as much food as was necessary to keep him from starvation, turned out to repeat the process of putting on his, this time more deftly. Morin had a toboggan upon which were piled such necessaries as Madge had collected. They began their march 3 abreast into the storm. They went a long way without conversation, and yet Courthope found in this march keen enjoyment. His heart was absurdly light. To have performed so considerable a service for Madge, now to be walking beside her on an errand of mercy, was as much joy as the present hour could hold. It was difficult for him to keep up with the others, yet in doing so there was the pleasure of the athlete in having acquired a new mastery over his muscles, and the fascination of being at home in the snow as a seabird is at home in the surf, which is the chief element of delight in all winter sports, was his for the first time. With the drunken wretch who was almost frozen, he felt small sympathy. But he had the sense that all modern men have on such occasions, that he ought to be concerned, which kept him grave. The other two were not light-hearted. Morin, dragging the toboggan behind him and walking with his grey head bent forward to the gale, was sullen at being driven in the service of thieves. Afraid lest some sinister design was still intended, he cast constant glances of cunning suspicion at Courthope. As for Madge, she appeared grave and preoccupied beyond all that was natural to her, suffering, he feared, from the pain of her first disillusionment. This was a suffering that he was hardly in a position to take seriously, and yet his heart yearned over her. He thought also that she was pondering over the problem of her next responsibility, and the evidence of this came sooner than he had expected. When they got to the place where his first track diverged straight to the shed, she and Morin stopped to exchange remarks. They evidently perceived in this the clearest evidence of all against him. Had he not gone straight to the place where the accomplice had agreed to wait? Then Madge fell back a little to where he was now plodding in the rear. She accosted him in the soft tones that had from the first so charmed him, contrasting with her sister's voice as the tones of a reed pipe contrast with those from metal, or as the full voice of the cuckoo with the shrill chirp of the sparrow. The soft voice was very serious, the manner more than sedate, the words studied. "I am afraid that nothing that I can say will persuade you to alter a way of life which you seem to have chosen, but it seems to me very sad that one of your ability should so degrade himself." She stopped with a little gasp for breath, as if frightened at her own audacity. Her manner and phrases were an evident imitation of the way in which she had heard advice bestowed upon vagrant or criminal by the benevolent judge whose memory she so tenderly cherished. It was second nature to her to act as she fancied he would have acted. Courthope composed himself to receive the judicial admonition with becoming humility. His whole sympathy was with her. His mind was aglow with the quaint humour of it. "You must know," rebuked Madge, "how very wrong it is, and it is not possible that you could have difficulty in getting some honest employment." "It is very kind of you to interest yourself in me." He kept his eyes upon the ground. "I do not know, of course, what led you to begin a life of crime, or in what way you found out what houses in this country were worth robbing, but I fear you must have led a wicked life for a long time." She was very severe now. "You are young yet. Why should you carry on your nefarious schemes in a new country, where, if you would, you could easily reform?" Again a little gasp for breath. "I have promised to let you go without giving you into the hands of the law. I am afraid I did a selfish and weak thing, because others may suffer from your crimes, and I wish you could take this opportunity which my leniency gives you, and try to reform before you have lost your reputation as well as your character." "It is very kind of you," he murmured again, and still as he walked he looked upon his feet. He had no thought now of again denying his guilt. Having denied and, as she thought, confessed, he felt that to change once more would only evoke her greater scorn. "Let be," his heart said. "Let come what will. I will not confuse her further today." End of chapter 5. Section 22 of A Dozen Ways of Love. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MaryAnn. A Dozen Ways of Love by Lily Dougall. A Freak of Cupid, Chapter 6. They passed the shed, making a straight march, as swift as might be, for the fallen man, but before they reached him they saw someone coming, a black, increasing form in the snowy distance. Morin hesitated. If the thief had arisen, strong and able-bodied, it was clear that they had again been tricked for an evil purpose. Even Madge looked alarmed, and they both raised a halloo in the patios of the region. The answer that came across the reach of the storm cheered them. The newcomer, a messenger from the nearest village, became voluble as soon as he was within speaking distance. He addressed Madge in broken English, but so quickly and with so strong a French accent that Courthope only gathered part of his errand. He had come, it seemed, from the stepmother to tell something concerning a certain Xavier, who had been sent to them the evening before. Before he had finished calling, Madge and Morin had come to the place where the thief lay, and, looking down upon him, Madge gave a little cry. The newcomer came up. He looked as if he might be of the grade of a notary's clerk or a country chemist. He did not seem surprised to see who the man was. He began at once with great activity to chafe his hands and face with handfuls of the snow. Madge and Morin were also active with the restoratives. The thief was lifted and laid upon the toboggan. They trod the snow all about to know that nothing remained, and found only a corkless flask containing a few drops of rum. They were all so busy that Courthope had little to do. He stood aside, wondering above all at the way they rubbed the man with the snow, and at the astonishment that Madge expressed. The stranger was very nimble and very talkative, pouring out words now in French to Madge. He walked with her in all haste to the shed from which the horse again whinnied. Morin, awakening to a sense of urgency, started at a trot, dragging the toboggan behind him. It sank heavily in snow so light. Courthope lent a hand to the loop of rope by which it was drawn. He, too, essayed the trot of the Canadian. He was growing proficient, and if he did not succeed in keeping up the running pace, he managed to go more quickly than before. They made fair progress. Looking back, Courthope saw Madge and the stranger emerge upon the road with the little horse. He had not time to look back often to see how they helped it to make its way. They were still some distance behind when he and Morin reached the house. The man called Xavier was carried into the kitchen amid wild exclamations from the Morin women. As they all continued the work of restoring him with a hearty goodwill and an experience of which Courthope could not boast, he was glad to betake himself to his own room, wondering whether he was now a thief or a gentleman in the eyes of this small snow-bound world. There was, in any case, no one at leisure to prohibit him from making free with his own possessions. When he was dressed, a certain shyness prohibited him from entering the dining-room in which he heard Madge, Eliz, and the stranger talking French together. He betook himself to the library, to the letters of the Portuguese nun, and an easy-chair. They might oust him with severity, but it was well to enjoy a short interval of luxury. The room was warmed with a stove. The book was in the old-fashioned type. An almost sleepless night was behind him. Soon he slept. It was almost midday when he slept. The afternoon was advancing when he awakened. Madame Morin was standing beside him arranging a tray of food upon the table. "Eh," she said, and smiled upon him. Then she pointed to the food and demanded in pantomime if it suited him. Courthope concluded that he had ceased to be in disgrace. He would rather, much rather, have been summoned to a family meal, but that was not in his lot. He had taken many things philosophically in the course of recent hours, and he took this also. What right had he to intrude himself? He ate his meal alone. His roving glance soon brought him pleasure, for he found that someone had tiptoed into the room while he slept and laid the choicest volumes of romance near his chair. The wind had dropped, the snow had ceased falling. Before Courthope had finished his luncheon, the young man who looked like a notary's clerk came in, using his broken English. He remarked that the storm was over and that they were now going to get out a double team to plough through the road. He suggested that Courthope should help him to drive it, and to transport the prisoner to the jail in the village. One man must be left to protect the young ladies and the house. One man must help him with the team and its burden. The speaker shrugged his shoulders, suggesting that it would be more suitable for Morin to remain, and said that for his part he would be much obliged and honoured if Courthope would accompany him. Here some plain and easy compliments were thrown in about Courthope's strength and the generous activity he had displayed, but not a word concerning his temporary disgrace. If this man knew of it, he did not regard it as of any importance. He was a matter-of-fact young man, not much interested in Courthope as a stranger, immensely interested in the fact of the theft and all that concerned it. At the slightest question he poured out excited information. Xavier had been a servant in the house. Mrs. King, who was religious and zealous, had found in him a convert. He had become a Protestant to please her. At this point the narrator shrugged his shoulders again. Then Xavier had asked higher wages. Upon that there was a quarrel, and he had left. The speaker's scanty English was of the simplest. He said, "Xavier is a very bad man, much worse than our people usually are. This winter he went to the city and got his wits sharpened, and when he came back he made a scheme. He sent word to Mrs. King that his old father was dying and would like to be converted too. Mrs. King travels at once with a horse and the strongest servant man. The old father takes a long time to die, so Xavier comes here yesterday to say she will stay all night, but when he did not come back, his wife soon got frightened, and she told that the old man was not going to die, and that she was afraid there was a scheme. Now we have Xavier very safe. He may get 5 years." Upon Courthope's inquiring after the health of the thief, he was told that beyond being severely frostbitten, he was little worse. He was again drunk with the stimulants that the Morins had poured down his throat. The visitor ended the interview by saying that if Courthope would be good enough to drive the team through the drifts, his own horse and sleigh would be sent after him the next day. Courthope inquired what was the wish of the young mistress of the house. The other replied that Mademoiselle approved of his plan. It was evident that poor Madge was no longer the mistress. The clerk was an emissary of Mrs. King's, and as such he had taken the control. Still, as he was an amiable and capable person, Courthope fell in with his suggestion, inwardly vowing that soon of some domain, if not of this one, Madge should again be queen. Courthope received a message to the effect that the young ladies wished to see him. There was something in the formal wording of this message, coming after his solitary meal, which made him know that they were ill at ease, that they had taken their mistake more deeply to heart than he would have wished. He had no sooner entered the room where Madge stood than he wished he were well out of it again. So far did his sympathy with her discomfort transcend his own pleasure at being in her presence. Madge stood, as upon the first night, behind her sister's chair. Eliz looked frightened and excited, yet as half enjoying the novel excitement. Madge, pale-faced and distressed, showed only too plainly that she had need of all the courage she possessed to lift her eyes to his. Yet she was not going to shirk her duty. She was going to make her apology, and the apology of the household, just as the judge, her father, would have wished to have it made. It was a little speech, conned beforehand, which she spoke, a quaint mixture of her own girlish wording and the formal phrases which she felt the occasion demanded. Courthope never knew precisely what she said. His feelings were up and in tumult, like the winds on a gusty day, and he was embarrassed for her embarrassment, while he smiled for the very joy of it all. Madge confessed with grief that Eliz had mistaken Xavier for Courthope. She said the man from the village had shown them what folly it was to suppose that the gentleman could be Xavier's accomplice. She begged that same gentleman's pardon very humbly. At the end he heard some words faltered. She wished it was in their power to make any amends. Almost before she ceased speaking he took up the word, and his own voice sounded to him merry and bold in comparison with her soft, distressful speech. But he could not help it. He must speak with such powers as nature gave him. "There are 2 ways by which you can make amends. And first, I would beg that none of our friends who were here last night should be told of it. I should not like to think that Emma and Elizabeth, and Evelina or Mariana Alcoforado should ever hear that I was taken for a thief." You are laughing at us, said Eliz sharply. We know that you will go away and make fun of us to all your friends. If I do, you will have one way of punishing me that would give me more pain than I could well endure. You can shut me out next time I come to ask for shelter. Oh, but you can't come again, said Eliz, with a vibrating note of fierce discontent. Our stepmother will be here. He looked at Madge. I was going to say that the other way in which you could make amends would be to give me leave to come back. And if you give me leave, I will come, even if it be necessary, to that end, to get an introduction from all the clergy in Great Britain, or from the royal family. A ray of hope shot into Madge's dark eyes. The first glimmer of a smile began to show through her distrust. It is an old adage that where there is a will, there is a way. And did I not walk on your most impossible snowshoes and bring back your silver? Madge looked down. A pretty red began to mantle her pale face, and, as if the angels who managed the winds and clouds did not wish that the blush of so dear a maiden should betray too much, a ray of scarlet light from the sinking sun just then came winging through the dispersing storm clouds, and caused all the white snow world to redden, and dyed the frost flowers on the window pane, and, entering where the pane was bare, lit all the room with soft vermilion light. So, in the wondrous blush of the white world, the girl's cheeks glowed, and yet did not confess too much. You will allow me to send in your compliments, and inquire after Mr. Woodhouse as I pass. This was Courthope's farewell to Eliz, and she called joyfully in reply. You need not send back his message, for we shall know that they are all very indifferent. Into the scarlet shining of the western sun, an omen of fair weather and delight, Courthope set forth again from the square tin-roofed house, leaving, as the saying is, his heart behind him. The large farm horses, restive from long confinement and stimulated by the frost, shook their bells with energy. The Morin women displayed such goodwill and even tenderness in their attentions to the comfort of the second prisoner, in whom they had found an old friend, that, tied in a blanket and lying full length on the straw of a box-sleigh, he looked content with himself and the world, albeit he had not as yet returned from the happy roving places of the drunken brain. The talkative clerk was glad enough to give Courthope the reins of the masterful horses. He sat on one edge of the blue-painted box, and Courthope on the other. Thus they started, bravely plunging into the drifts between the poplars. The drifts were all tinged with pink. The poplars, intercepting the red light upon their slender upright boughs, cast, each of them, a clear shadow that seemed to lie in endless length athwart the glowing sward. Courthope looked back at the house which had been so dim and phantom-like the night before. The red sun lit the icicles that hung from eaves and lintels, tinged the drifts, glowed upon the windows as if with light from within, and turned the steep tin roof into a gigantic rose. But all his glance was centred upon his lady-love, who stood, regardless of the cold, at the entrance of the drift-encircled porch, and watched them as long as the sunlight lay upon the land. Was she looking at the plunging sleigh and at its driver, or at the chasms of light in the rent clouds beyond? His heart told him, as he drove on into the very midst of the sunset which had embraced the glistening land, that the maid, although not regardless of the outer glory, only rejoiced in its beauty because the vision of her heart was focused upon him. His heart, in telling him this, taught him no pride, for had he not learned in the same small space of time only to count himself rich in what she gave? Slow was the progress of the great horses. They passed the grove of high elms and birches that, dressed in the snowflakes that had lodged in boughs and branches when the wind dropped, stood up clear against the gulfs of blue that now opened above and beyond. Then the house was hidden, and after that, by degrees, the light of the sunset passed away. The End. End of Chapter 6 of A Freak of Cupid, and The End of A Dozen Ways of Love by Lily Dougall.